She was bleeding in the Korean Mafia boss's backseat. He found out her ex-husband was beating her. The heavy door slammed shut, slicing the world in half. 1 second, the air was filled with the sounds of the city and my son screaming my name. The next, there was only the hum of an engine and the smell of copper mixing with expensive cologne. I pressed my palm against the tinted glass, smearing red stains on the pristine window. Ernest was right there on the sidewalk, his small hands beating against the other side of the glass, his mouth wide in a terror that I had caused. He was shouting for me, but the sound was muffled, distant, like he was already underwater. Then the lock clicked. The car began to move. I wasn't being rescued. I was being stolen. If you know the panic of running out of time, hit like and subscribe and comment your city and time. I turned my head slowly, terrified of what I would see. The man sitting next to me hadn't moved a muscle. He wasn't looking at the window. He was looking at my temple. I felt the warm, sticky slide of liquid down my neck. I touched it, my fingers coming away wet and bright red. Gerald had done this. He had finally used the heavy end of his pistol instead of his fist. But Gerald wasn't the one who scared me right now. It was the man in the suit. He didn't offer me a tissue. He didn't ask if I was okay. He just watched the blood drip onto his Italian leather seats with a stillness that made my stomach turn over. This wasn't the concern of a good Samaritan. It was the cold calculation of a predator watching a wounded animal. I tried to shrink into the corner, to make myself invisible like I did at home, but there was nowhere to go. His eyes were dark voids, absorbing my shame, seeing every bruise I had hidden for years. He knew. He saw the wreckage Gerald had made of me, and he didn't look sorry. He looked offended. Not for my sake, but because someone had damaged something he had decided was his. The car accelerated, leaving my screaming child behind on the curb. I opened my mouth to beg, but the look on his face stopped the sound in my throat. He reached out, not to comfort me, but to wipe a drop of blood from my chin with his thumb. "You were warned," he said, his voice low and vibrating with a violence he hadn't let out yet. "Noise has consequences. People think it happens all at once. They think you walk into a punch and decide to stay. That is a lie. It happens in whispers. It happens in the silence before the noise. Before I was bleeding in that car, before I was a mother separated from her child, I was a woman who thought she was loved." Gerald didn't start with violence. He started with suggestions. He suggested I change my dress because the neckline was too low for a mother. He suggested I stop seeing my sister because she was a bad influence. By the time I realized his suggestions were actually steel bars, the cage was already locked. I stayed because of Ernest. Gerald wasn't his biological father, but he knew exactly how to use him against me. "You leave," Gerald would say, smiling over his morning coffee, "and I'll make sure you never see that boy again. I have money, Michaela. You have nothing." He was right. I had nothing. I was an educated woman who had been reduced to flinching when the toaster popped. The shame was a heavy, wet blanket I wore every single day. I smiled at the neighbors. I covered the bruises on my arms with long sleeves, even in summer. I became an expert at lying to myself in the mirror. But the turning point wasn't a hit. It was a piece of paper. It was a Tuesday night, raining. Gerald was out drinking. I was looking at our bank statement, trying to figure out how to squeeze a pair of sneakers for Ernest out of the remaining $12. His toes were poking through the canvas of his old ones. Then I saw it. A charge for a hotel downtown. $300. One night. He had spent 3 months of grocery money on a woman, while his stepson walked to school with wet socks. Something inside my chest snapped. It wasn't a loud snap. It was quiet, like a bone breaking under too much weight. I didn't cry. I sat there in the dark kitchen, listening to the refrigerator hum, and I felt a cold, hard knot form in my stomach. It wasn't courage. It was hate. Pure, distilled hate. I realized then that he wasn't just hurting me. He was eating us alive. I needed money he couldn't touch. I needed a secret. That was the night I decided to take the cleaning job. That was the night I decided to lie to the monster. I didn't know then that the building I would clean belonged to a bigger monster. I didn't know that trying to save my son would end with me watching him scream through a sheet of glass. All I knew was that I was done being a victim. I was going to be a survivor, even if it killed me. I took a job working the graveyard shift, cleaning offices in a high-rise downtown from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. It was humbling work. I used to manage teams. Now I was emptying trash bins for people who didn't know my name. But that building was where the trap was set. It was where I met him, the man who was currently watching me bleed. I thought I was finding a way out, but I was just digging a deeper hole. I didn't realize that the consequences were already unfolding. I had started a war I wasn't equipped to fight, and the price of that war wouldn't be paid in money. It would be paid in blood. That building became the only place where I could breathe. At home, the air was always thick, waiting for the next explosion. But the high-rise downtown was cold, quiet, and indifferent. I worked the graveyard shift, 10 at night until 6 in the morning, scrubbing floors and emptying bins for people who would never know I existed. The top 3 floors were different from the rest. The carpet was thicker there, absorbing the sound of my footsteps. The brass fixtures gleamed under the dim night lights. The air smelled of lemon polish and money. This was his domain. I didn't know his name back then, not really. The other cleaning staff just called him the chairman. We spoke about him in hushed tones, the way you talk about a storm that hasn't hit yet. I saw him only a few times in those first 3 months. He would step out of the private elevator in the small hours of the morning, flanked by 2 men who moved like trained Dobermans. He never looked at me. He looked through me. To him, I was just part of the hallway, as functional and invisible as a light switch. I preferred it that way. Being seen was dangerous. Being invisible was safe. Or so I thought. The change began on a Tuesday, driven by pure exhaustion. I was cleaning the conference room on the 30th floor, my body aching. My mind wasn't on the dust. It was replaying a fight from earlier that evening. Gerald had thrown a plate of spaghetti against the wall, inches from Ernest's head. The sound of the ceramic shattering was still ringing in my ears. I turned too quickly. My hip bumped the pedestal table near the window. The movement was clumsy, heavy with fatigue. The expensive, abstract sculpture on top wobbled. I lunged for it, but I was too slow. It didn't fall, but it tipped hard against the marble wall. Click. A small, distinct sound. I froze. I pulled the sculpture back upright. There, at the base, was a chip. A piece of the black stone, no bigger than a fingernail, lay on the table. Panic, cold and sharp, flooded my chest. This was it. I was going to be fired. I would lose the secret income. I would be trapped with Gerald forever. I stood there for 10 minutes, shaking. I could have hidden it. I could have turned the sculpture around so the chip faced the wall. No one would check. But something in me refused to lie. I had spent so years lying to cover up Gerald's abuse. I couldn't do it here. With a trembling hand, I wrote a note on a sticky pad. I am sorry. I caused this damage. Please take it out of my pay. I stuck it to the base of the broken stone. Then I packed up my cart and left, terrified that I had just signed my own death warrant. The next night, the call came exactly as I expected. I had just punched in at the basement clock when the building manager, a nervous man named Mr. Henderson, waved me down. "Michaela," he said, his voice tight. "My office. Now." My stomach dropped all the way to my shoes. I wiped my palms on my uniform pants, trying to stop the shaking. This was the end. I began calculating how many groceries I could buy with my final paycheck before Gerald found out I was unemployed again. I walked into the office with my head down, ready to beg. I needed this job. I was prepared to offer to work for free to pay off the damage. But Mr. Henderson didn't look angry. He looked confused. He was sitting behind his desk, holding a thick, cream-colored envelope. He looked at it, then at me, as if he couldn't reconcile the two. "The chairman noticed the damage to the sculpture this morning," he said. I squeezed my eyes shut, waiting for the yelling. "He also found your note." Mr. Henderson slid the envelope across the desk. "He told me to give you this." I stared at it. It wasn't a termination notice. It was too heavy. I reached out, my fingers numb, and opened the flap. Inside, there was a stack of bills. Hundreds. I counted them in my head, my breath catching in my throat. $5,000. "I don't understand," I whispered. "Is this am I being sued?" Mr. Henderson shook his head, looking more bewildered than I was. "No. He said you were honest enough to admit a mistake when you could have easily hidden it. He said integrity is a rare currency." He paused, reciting the message he had clearly been ordered to memorize. "He wants you to cover your expenses for the month. He said you look distracted, and distracted people make mistakes. Fix whatever is distracting you." I stood there, clutching the envelope. It felt heavy, like holding a brick of gold. It wasn't kindness. I knew kindness. Kindness was warm. This felt cold. It felt transactional. It felt like a king tossing a coin to a beggar because her shivering was annoying him. He wasn't paying me because he cared. He was paying me to be efficient again. But $5,000, that was a deposit on an apartment. That was a way out. I took the money. I didn't know then that I wasn't accepting a gift. I was accepting a down payment on my soul. I used that cash to rent a tiny studio apartment across town under my maiden name. I thought I was buying my freedom. I didn't realize that by taking that money, I had allowed the chairman to step out of the elevator and right into the center of my life. The web had been spun, and I had just walked right into it. A week later, the fragile piece I had built came crashing down at 2 in the morning. I was on the 30th floor, emptying a trash bin near the reception desk, when the radio on the guard's desk crackled to life. The volume was turned up, and through the static, I heard a voice I knew better than my own heartbeat. It was Gerald. He was screaming. My blood turned into ice water. He had found out about the job. I don't know how. Maybe he followed me. Maybe he checked the mileage on the car. But he was downstairs, in the lobby of this pristine, silent building, sounding like a wild animal. I stood frozen, my hands gripping the plastic liner of the bin, unable to breathe. I walked over to the security monitors behind the desk. I shouldn't have looked, but I couldn't help it. On the grainy black and white screen, I saw him. Gerald was shoving his finger into the night watchman's face, his mouth wide open in a shout I could almost hear through the floorboards. He was drunk, his movements sloppy and violent. He was demanding his lying wife be sent down. He was calling me names that bounced off the expensive marble walls, staining the perfect atmosphere of the building. I was paralyzed with a humiliation so deep it felt like burning. I knew what happened when Gerald got embarrassed publicly. He took it out on my skin. I prepared myself to go down there, to surrender, just to make the noise stop. Then, on the monitor, the elevator doors in the lobby slid open. The change in the air was visible even through a screen. Kyung-soo stepped out. He was alone this time, without his usual guards. He didn't rush. He didn't look alarmed. He wore a dark overcoat and moved with a terrifying lack of urgency. He simply drifted toward the commotion like a sudden drop in temperature. Gerald, who was mid-shout, saw him and stopped. I couldn't see Kyung-soo's face from the camera angle, only the back of his head. But I saw Gerald's face clearly. I saw a man twice my size, a man who reveled in his physical dominance, suddenly shrink. His posture collapsed. He took a step back, stumbling over his own feet. Kyung-soo didn't gesture. He didn't point toward the door. He just stood there, an absolute void of emotion in a chaotic room. He spoke just a few words, too low for the security microphone to pick up. Whatever he said, it drained the color right out of Gerald's face. My husband turned around, pale and shaking, and walked out of the building without looking back. He didn't come home that night. When I left work at 6 in the morning, the head of security was waiting for me by the exit. He didn't sneer at me like he usually did. He held the door open, his eyes fixed on the floor. "Mr. Park offers his apologies for the disturbance," he mumbled. "He assures you it will not happen again." I walked to the bus stop in a daze. Mr. Park. Kyung-soo. He had apologized to me. He had shamed a bully without lifting a finger. It was the moment the world shifted. It was the moment I realized that something far more dangerous than Gerald had taken notice of me. Now, pause and ask yourself, why would a man who runs the city apologize to a cleaning lady? If you think it's just kindness, you're not paying attention. Hit that subscribe button right now because you have no idea what he's about to ask for in return. Over the next month, I watched my husband disintegrate. It didn't happen with a bang. It happened with a slow, suffocating squeeze. It started the very next day. Gerald worked off the books for a construction firm that didn't ask questions about his background. He came home at noon, throwing his hard hat across the kitchen. He had been fired. No explanation, no severance, just a foreman telling him to get off the site before he called the police. Gerald raged about it for hours, drinking cheap beer and blaming the economy. I stayed quiet, washing dishes, trying to keep my hands from trembling. I knew it wasn't the economy. 2 days later, his friends stopped answering his calls. Gerald had always relied on a small circle of low-level criminals to help him move stolen goods or borrow cash. Suddenly, those phones were dead. He would call, leave angry voicemails, and get nothing but silence in return. He became paranoid, pacing the living room, checking the window blinds every 10 minutes. "They're freezing me out," he muttered, his eyes bloodshot and frantic. "Someone told them I'm heat." "Who told them I'm heat?" He looked at me with suspicion, but he dismissed it instantly. In his mind, I was too weak to cause this kind of damage. I was just the punching bag. He couldn't imagine that the punching bag had powerful friends. Then the debts were called in. Gerald owed money to dangerous people, the kind of people who usually let you pay interest forever. But that week, they all demanded full payment at once. They weren't asking, they were threatening. Gerald was scrambling, selling his tools, selling the television, selling anything that wasn't nailed down. He was sweating through his shirts, jumping at shadows. For the first time in our marriage, he was too distracted by his own fear to focus on hurting me. He ignored Ernest. He ignored me. He was a drowning man trying to keep his head above water, not realizing that someone had tied an anchor to his ankle. I didn't connect the dots immediately. I thought it was just karma finally catching up to a bad man. But then I went to the grocery store to buy milk. I used the emergency credit card Gerald kept in his wallet, the one he forbade me to touch. It was declined. I tried again. Declined. I called the number on the back of the card. The operator told me the account had been closed by the bank due to risk assessment. I stood in the checkout line, humiliated, putting the milk back. But as I walked out to the parking lot, a cold realization settled over me. Banks don't close accounts like that on a whim. Foremen don't fire reliable workers without cause. This was surgical. It was precise. Someone was systematically stripping Gerald of every ounce of power he had. Someone was isolating him, cornering him, removing his claws one by one. I remembered the stillness in the lobby. I remembered the envelope of cash. I realized then that Kyung-soo wasn't just protecting his building. He was hunting, and he was using my husband as sport. It should have terrified me. It should have made me run. But watching Gerald sweat, watching him taste a fraction of the fear he had fed me for years, God help me, it felt like justice. The claim didn't happen with a grand declaration or a contract. It happened on a dirty subway platform at 11 at night. I was coming home late, my body heavy with exhaustion, carrying a bag of stolen office supplies, toilet paper and soap, because Gerald had drunk our household budget again. The platform was mostly empty, except for a group of 3 men standing near the turnstiles. They were loud, passing a bottle between them, their laughter echoing off the tiled walls. I kept my head down, clutching my bag, trying to make myself small. It was a survival instinct I had perfected. But tonight, small wasn't enough. They spotted me. One of them whistled. Then they started walking toward me. "Hey, sweetheart," the tall one slurred, stepping into my path. "You look lonely." I braced myself, the familiar adrenaline flooding my system. I mapped out the exits in my head. I prepared to run. The tall one reached out, his hand aiming for my arm. I flinched, closing my eyes, waiting for the grab. But it never came. The air suddenly went dead silent. The footsteps stopped. I opened my eyes. The man was frozen, his hand suspended in midair. He wasn't looking at me anymore. He was looking over my shoulder, his eyes wide and sober with sudden fear. He took a stumbling step back, grabbing the arms of his friends and physically yanking them away. "We're going," he muttered, his voice shaking. "Now, move." They retreated, heads down, murmuring apologies to the empty air, scrambling up the stairs like they had seen a ghost. I turned around slowly. There was no ghost. Just a well-dressed Korean man standing about 20 feet away, casually reading a newspaper on a bench. I recognized him instantly. He was one of the Dobermans I had seen flanking Kyung-soo in the elevator. He wore a suit that cost more than my life, standing out against the grime of the subway station. He didn't look at me. He turned a page of his paper, his expression completely blank, as if he hadn't just terrified 3 grown men into running away without saying a word. The realization hit me hard enough to steal my breath. He wasn't commuting. He was working, and I was the assignment. He protected her, but he didn't speak to her. Why is a billionaire mafia boss shadowing a cleaning lady? What is the price of this protection? If you think you know his motive, you're wrong. Tell me in the comments what you think he wants from her. I walked the rest of the way home that night with a strange, icy sensation in my chest. I wasn't just Michaela, the victim. I was marked property. I was under a protection I hadn't asked for, from a man whose power was so absolute he didn't even need to be present to wield it. It should have horrified me, to trade one cage for another. But God help me, I didn't look over my shoulder once. The end came fast. It didn't arrive with a warning or a slow build-up. It was waiting for me in the living room when I opened the front door. The apartment was usually loud, the TV blaring, Gerald yelling at the news, the neighbors arguing through the thin walls. But tonight, it was silent. A thick, heavy silence that tasted like copper. My stomach dropped. I knew this silence. It was the calm before a hurricane. I stepped inside, my keys jingling softly in the lock, and saw him. Gerald was sitting on the sagging couch in the dark. He wasn't drinking. That was the first bad sign. Gerald only stayed sober when he was planning something violent. On the coffee table in front of him, illuminated by a single lamp, lay 2 things that stopped my heart cold. The first was a folded piece of paper, the lease for the secret studio apartment I had rented with Kyung-soo's money. The second was my burner phone, cracked open, the battery lying next to it like a dead insect. He had found everything. "You think you're clever?" he asked. His voice was barely a whisper, but it carried more weight than a scream. He looked up at me, and I saw a stranger. This wasn't the sloppy, bullying drunk I had learned to manage. This was a man who had lost everything, his job, his money, his reputation, and now he had found the person he could blame for it. He looked like a drowning animal that had decided to take the water down with him. "Gerald," I started, my voice trembling. "I can explain." "Explain?" He stood up. He moved faster than I had ever seen him move. In one motion, he reached behind the sofa cushions and pulled out a gun. It was a black pistol, heavy and ugly. He pointed it right at my chest. "You used my money to rent a place? You think you can just walk away from me? You belong to me, Michaela. You don't get to leave until I say you're done." I backed up until my spine hit the front door. Please, I begged, tears hot and instant in my eyes. Just let us go? You don't want this. I have nothing left to want, he roared, the sudden noise making me jump. They took everything. And now I find out my own wife is laughing at me behind my back. He racked the slide of the gun. The sound was a loud, mechanical clack that signaled the end of my life. Where is the boy? No, I whispered. Leave Ernest out of this. Bring him here, he screamed, waving the gun toward the hallway where Ernest's bedroom was. I want us all together. We're going to have a family meeting. The last one. I didn't move. I couldn't. My legs were lead. He wasn't trying to control me anymore. He wasn't trying to keep me. He was going to kill us. I saw it in his eyes, a flat, dead resolve. The slow destruction of the last month had broken his mind, and now he was going to break our bodies to match. I stood there, staring down the barrel of the gun, realizing that my secret plan, the money, the hope, it had all led to this. I had tried to outsmart a monster, and instead, I had cornered him. The trigger didn't click. The explosion didn't come from the gun in Gerald's hand. It came from the front of the apartment. It wasn't a knock, and it wasn't a kick. It was a sudden, violent disintegration of wood and metal. The entire door frame seemed to vanish inward, filling the entryway with a cloud of dust and splinters. Before Gerald's brain could even process the noise, the room was full. It wasn't the police. The police shout. They announced themselves. These men were silent. 4 of them poured into our small, shabby living room like a flood of dark water. They moved with a terrifying, synchronized efficiency that made no sense in my chaotic world. Gerald tried to turn. He tried to lift the gun, but he was moving in slow motion compared to them. 2 of the men were on him before he could take a breath. There was a sickening crunch of bone hitting the floorboards, followed by the heavy thud of a body being slammed down. The gun skittered across the carpet, sliding under the armchair, useless. Gerald groaned, his face pressed into the dirty rug, his arm twisted behind his back at an angle that looked impossible. The other 2 men didn't look at the fight. They looked at the corners of the room, clearing the space, their eyes scanning for threats with cold precision. The violence lasted less than 5 seconds. Then, the room went dead still again. That was when Kyung-soo walked in. He stepped over the jagged remains of my front door without looking down. He wasn't wearing body armor. He wasn't holding a weapon. He was wearing a charcoal suit that was perfectly pressed, his hands hanging loosely by his sides. He walked into the middle of the wreckage as if he were entering a boardroom. The contrast was jarring. My cheap furniture, the smell of stale beer and fear, and this man who looked like he owned the skyline. He stopped in the center of the room. He didn't look at me yet. He looked at Gerald. He looked down at my husband the way a health inspector looks at a rat infestation. There was no anger in his face. There was only a profound, disappointed boredom. You have disappointed me, Kyung-soo said softly. His voice was low, cultured, and barely audible over the sound of my own thudding heart. I allowed you to exist because you were insignificant. You were a minor variable. But you have become noisy. Gerald tried to speak. He tried to spit out a curse, to beg, to say something, but the man holding him pressed a knee harder into his spine, forcing the air out of his lungs in a sharp wheeze. Kyung-soo tilted his head, watching Gerald struggle. I dislike noise, Kyung-soo continued, his tone conversational. It disrupts business. It disturbs the peace. And you, Gerald, have been very loud tonight. He finally looked up. He turned his head slowly, and for the first time since I started working in his building, he truly looked me in the eyes. It wasn't the passing glance in the elevator. It wasn't the blank stare of a stranger. It was an appraisal. He saw the split lip where Gerald had hit me earlier. He saw the terror in my posture. He saw the way I was shielding Ernest in the corner, my body curled around my son like a shell. He saw the truth I had been hiding from the world for years. The shame burned through me, hot and fast. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. His gaze held me there, pinned against the wall just as effectively as his men held my husband. He didn't look like a savior. He looked like a judge who had just arrived at the scene of a crime, and I wasn't sure if I was the witness or the evidence. Kyung-soo stared at the blood on my face for a long time. The silence in the room was heavy, suffocating. I could hear Ernest breathing fast and shallow against my chest, his small fingers digging into my shirt. I expected Kyung-soo to speak to me. I expected him to ask if I was hurt, or tell me it was over. But he didn't. He turned to the man standing nearest to me, a large guard with a scar running through his eyebrow. Get her out of here, Kyung-soo said. His voice was flat, devoid of warmth. Take the boy separately. He shouldn't see this part. The words took a second to register. When they did, panic spiked in my chest, sharper than any blow Gerald had ever landed. Separately. No. I whispered, clutching Ernest tighter. I backed further into the corner. No, please. Don't separate us. He's scared. You can't take him. Kyung-soo paused. He looked at Ernest. My son was shaking, his eyes wide and wet, staring at the man on the floor who used to be his stepfather. For a fraction of a second, something flickered in Kyung-soo's dark eyes. It wasn't pity. It was a crack in the eye. It is for his safety, Kyung-soo said. There was a trace of gentleness in it now, but it was still a command. He cannot stay in this room for what happens next. Go. He nodded to the guard. The man moved forward. He wasn't rough, but he was firm. He reached out and peeled Ernest's fingers off my shirt. Come on, son, the guard muttered. Ernest started screaming. It was a high, thin sound that ripped my heart in half. Mommy. Mommy, no. Ernest. I lunged for him, but another set of hands grabbed my arms. I fought them. I kicked and twisted, screaming for them to stop. I didn't care about the gun anymore. I didn't care about Gerald. They were taking my baby. Let him go. Please. He needs me. They dragged me toward the door. I watched them carry Ernest out first, his legs kicking in the air, his face contorted in pure terror. Then they shoved me out into the cool night air. A large black SUV was parked at the curb, the engine running. They opened the back door and pushed me inside. The leather seats were cool against my skin. I scrambled to the window, pressing my face against the glass. That's the moment. That is the moment the world broke. I was inside the car. The door slammed shut, sealing me in. The man next to me was Kyung-soo. He had followed me out, leaving his men inside the house with Gerald. He was looking at me, and for the first time, the distance was gone. He wasn't looking through me. He was seeing the wreckage. He looked. I don't know if it was angry or sad. Maybe both. He looked like a man realizing the extent of the damage he hadn't prevented sooner. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a white handkerchief, offering it to me. But I wasn't looking at him. I was looking out the window. Ernest had broken away from the man holding him on the sidewalk. He ran to the car. He was banging on the glass, his small palm leaving smudges on the tint. He was screaming for his mother. I pressed my hand against the glass, matching his hand on the other side. I was safe. Gerald was being dealt with inside that house in ways I didn't want to imagine. I was sitting next to the most powerful man in the city. But as I looked at my son's terrified face, I realized that the rescue wasn't over. The hardest part was just beginning. I had survived the monster in my house, only to be delivered into the hands of a different kind of monster entirely. I woke up to a silence so deep it hurt my ears. There was no screaming, no television blaring, no sirens outside, just the rhythmic, quiet beep of a machine somewhere to my left. I blinked, trying to clear the heavy fog from my brain. I wasn't in a hospital. The sheets were silk, gray and cool against my skin. The ceiling was high, lost in shadow. I sat up too fast, and a sharp pain shot through my temple. I reached up and felt a thick bandage. Stitches. Someone had sewn me back together while I slept. A man in a white coat was packing a bag in the corner. He didn't look like a normal doctor. He looked expensive. You are awake, he said, not turning around. Try not to move too much. The cut was deep, but it will heal. Where's my son? My voice rasped like sandpaper against stone. Where is Ernest? He is safe, the doctor said. He snapped his bag shut and walked to the door. Mr. Park will explain everything. Then he left. The lock didn't click, but the sound of the heavy door closing felt final. I swung my legs out of the bed. I was wearing pajamas I didn't own. Soft, slate gray silk. I walked to the window. It was floor-to-ceiling glass. Below me, the city looked like a circuit board of golden lights. I was high up, penthouse level, the kind of place you only see in movies or dreams. But this wasn't a dream. I touched the cold glass. I was alive. I wasn't bleeding anymore. But as I looked at the reflection of the room behind me, the sleek, dark furniture, the security cameras blinking in the corners, the panic started to rise again. I walked to the door and pushed it open. Two men in suits were standing there. They didn't stop me, but they didn't move out of the way either. They just looked at me. I was free to walk around the room, but I wasn't free to leave. I backed up and shut the door. I sat on the edge of the bed, shivering. I had prayed for a way out of my house. I had prayed for someone to save me. Now, sitting in this golden cage, I realized that prayers get answered in twisted ways. I wasn't a guest here. I was something else. I was a bird with a mended wing, kept in a jar to be looked at, and I didn't know what the keeper wanted in return. The door opened an hour later. There was no knock. Kyung-soo didn't knock on doors he owned. He walked in carrying a thick manila folder. He had changed out of his suit into a dark turtleneck and trousers, looking less like a CEO and more like a shadow. He didn't smile. He didn't ask how I was feeling. He walked straight to the small table by the window and dropped the folder onto the glass surface. The sound echoed in the quiet room. Sit, he said. It wasn't a shout. It was a statement of fact, like saying the sky is blue. I sat opposite him, pulling the silk robe tighter around myself. Where is he? Where is Ernest? He is sleeping, Kyung-soo said. He is in the east wing. He has a room with a view of the river. He ate a full meal. He is fine. He pushed the folder toward me. Open it. My hands shook as I lifted the cover. Inside were photographs. Grainy pictures of Gerald meeting with men in back alleys. Copies of bank statements showing zero balances. And a police report. A missing person report for Gerald, already filed and stamped. He is gone, Kyung-soo said, watching my face. The debts he owed have been absorbed. The threat he posed has been neutralized. You have a clean slate, Michaela. A bank account has been opened in your name. It has enough money to start over anywhere you want. I looked up at him, confused. You're letting me go? Kyung-soo stood up and walked around the table. He stopped right next to my chair. The air around him felt charged, electric. He reached out and tilted my chin up with one finger. His skin was cool. I did not say that. He looked down at me, his eyes tracing the line of the bandage on my forehead. I watched you for 3 months. I saw you scrub floors until your hands bled. I saw you take insults from men who aren't fit to shine your shoes. Most people would have broken. You did not break. You endured. He ran his thumb over my lower lip, a touch that was possessive, not romantic. I do not invest in broken things, Michaela. I invest in things that have value. You have value. I cleared the weeds from your garden not because I am kind, but because I intend to keep the flower. He let go of my chin and stepped back. You can leave if you want. Take the money. Go back to being a nobody. But you know what happens to women like you out there without protection. Or, you can stay. You can be safe. You can be powerful. But if you stay, you belong to the house. You belong to me. I looked at the file. I looked at him. I realized then that I wasn't looking at a savior. I was looking at a buyer. And I had just been sold. The car ride took an hour, heading north out of the city. We left the noise and the grit behind, trading gray concrete for green trees and high iron gates. I didn't ask where we were going. I was too afraid of the answer. But when the black SUV finally slowed down, we weren't at a safe house or a holding cell. We were at the entrance of a private academy that looked more like a castle than a school. The security guards at the gate saluted Kyung-soo's driver. We rolled through, past manicured lawns and brick buildings that smelled of old money. We stopped near a wide, green field. Kyung-soo got out first, adjusting his cuffs. I scrambled out after him, my heart hammering against my ribs. Ernest. I called out, my voice breaking. Kyung-soo didn't answer. He just pointed. About 50 yards away, a group of boys were playing soccer. They were wearing uniforms, crisp navy shorts and bright, white jerseys. I squinted against the sun, scanning their faces. Then I saw him. Ernest was running near the goal. He was laughing. He wasn't wearing his old sneakers with the holes in the toes. He was wearing brand new cleats that flashed in the sunlight. He looked taller. He looked safe. He looked like a child who had never heard a gun go off in his living room. He kicked the ball, shouting with joy, completely unaware that his mother was standing 50 yards away, shaking in a silk dress she didn't own. He is happy, Kyung-soo said. He wasn't looking at the field. He was watching me. He has potential. Here, he will learn 3 languages. He will learn to fight. He will learn to lead. He will grow up to be a man who commands rooms, not a man who hides in them. I turned to him, tears hot in my eyes. He needs his mother. He needs a future, Kyung-soo corrected. His voice was hard, stripping away my defenses. If you take him now, you take him back to a life of fear. You take him back to poverty. You make him a victim again. Is that love, Michaela? Or is that selfishness? He stepped closer, blocking the sun. Or, you leave him here. I will pay for everything. I will ensure he becomes a king. But the price is you. You stay with me. You belong to the house. This is the moment that breaks every mother. Would you choose your freedom if it meant your child went back to wearing shoes with holes? Or would you sell your soul to the devil to make sure your son walked like a king? Hit the like button if you know exactly what she's about to choose. I looked back at the field. Ernest was celebrating a goal, high-fiving another boy. He looked free. If I took him, I would be dragging him back into the mud with me. If I left him, I lost him, but he won. I took a breath that felt like swallowing glass. I turned my back on my son. Do it, I whispered. Make him a king. 3 days later, the transformation was complete. I stood in front of a full-length mirror in the penthouse, barely recognizing the woman staring back. The bruise on my temple was covered with expert makeup. My hair, usually pulled back in a messy bun to keep it out of the bleach bucket, was styled in soft, dark waves. I was wearing a gown that cost more than I used to make in 5 years, midnight blue silk that clung to my body like a second skin. It was beautiful, but it felt heavy. It felt like armor. You look adequate, Kyung-soo said from the doorway. It was the highest compliment he gave. He offered his arm. He didn't ask if I was ready. In his world, you were always ready. We took the elevator down to the private garage and drove to the charity gala in silence. The event was held in a ballroom that dripped with crystal and gold. As we walked in, the conversation in the room noticeably dropped. Heads turned. Eyes narrowed. I felt the judgment washing over me. They knew who Kyung-soo was, the predator in the tuxedo. But they didn't know me. I saw them whispering, wondering who the new woman on his arm was. I wanted to shrink, to apologize for being there, to run back to the cleaning closet where I belonged. Kyung-soo felt me tense up. He didn't let go. Instead, his grip on my arm tightened, anchoring me to the floor. We moved through the crowd, stopping to speak to a senator and a tech billionaire. Then, a man with a red face and a loud laugh stepped into our path. I recognized him from the news. A rival developer Kyung-soo had crushed in a deal last year. Well, the man sneered, looking me up and down with open disrespect. I see you've picked up a new accessory, Park. Where did you find this one? The help wanted section? The air around us froze. The music seemed to stop. I looked down, shame burning my cheeks. He knew. He could see the poverty on me, no matter how expensive the dress was. Kyung-soo didn't shout. He didn't even blink. He took a sip of his champagne, staring the man dead in the eyes. Careful, Kyung-soo said softly. The menace in his voice was absolute. You are speaking to the lady of my house, and I protect my investments with extreme prejudice. Apologize, or leave this city tonight. The man's face went pale. He stammered a quick, terrified apology and disappeared into the crowd. Kyung-soo turned to me. He didn't smile, but his eyes were fierce. Lift your head, he commanded, low enough that only I could hear. You are with me now. No one looks down on you again. I lifted my chin. I looked at the room, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid. I was dangerous. We returned to the penthouse in silence. The drive back was a blur of city lights and dark tinted windows. I stood in front of the massive floor-to-ceiling glass, looking down at the streets where I used to scrub floors for minimum wage. It felt like looking at a different planet. I pressed my palm against the cool glass. It was the same glass I had pressed my hand against in the car, terrified and bleeding, reaching for my son. But now my hand was clean. My wrist was wrapped in a diamond bracelet that Kyung-soo had fastened there himself. I wasn't bleeding anymore. On the outside, I was healed. But scars don't disappear. They just go deeper where no one can see them. I was safe, yes, but I felt a coldness inside me that hadn't been there before. I heard him approach behind me. He didn't make a sound, but the air in the room shifted. It became heavier, charged with that strange, lethal electricity he carried. I watched our reflection in the window. He stood directly behind me, close enough that I could feel the heat of his body, but not touching me yet. He looked like a dark shadow looming over my shoulder. A month ago, a shadow behind me meant pain. It meant I had to duck. Now, the shadow meant that nothing else could touch me. I realized then that I had traded one fear for another. I wasn't afraid of the world anymore. I was afraid of becoming him. You are quiet, he said. His voice vibrated through the floorboards. It wasn't a question. He didn't ask questions he didn't know the answer to. I'm thinking about the cost, I replied, looking at his dark eyes in the reflection. Everything has a cost, Michaela, he murmured, stepping closer. Safety costs freedom. Power costs innocence. You have paid your bill. He reached out and placed his hand on my waist. It was a claim. He wasn't asking for permission. I didn't pull away. I leaned back against him, letting his strength support my weight. It felt wrong. It felt dangerous. But God help me, it felt good. I had spent my whole life being the prey. Standing here, in the arms of the wolf, I finally felt like part of the pack. I thought about Ernest, sleeping safely in his bed at the academy. I thought about Gerald,